Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Avi Asher-Schapiro. He's an independent investigative journalist based in New York City. His recent piece in The Intercept, as Uber probes sexual harassment at its offices, it overlooks hundreds of thousands of female drivers. Avi, how are you doing?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to just quote, actually, from the beginning of your piece, because it's pretty stunning. In 2012, shortly after Uber started operating in Los Angeles, Rachel Galindo bought a new car and signed up as a driver. She had worked as a journeyman carpenter, but contractors who used to hire her stopped calling after she transitioned her gender. Driving for Uber, Galindo hoped to avoid transphobia. After all, the company's old billboard made the tantalizing promise, "Be your own boss," quote unquote. The harassment began almost immediately. On 3 separate occasions, she said passengers got into her car without saying anything else and simply said, "How much for a BJ?" Another passenger kept referring to her as "it" during the ride, and when Galindo asked her to stop, the passengers responded, "Well, I just don't know who you are." She repeatedly complained to Uber about such incidents. Take us from there. How did Uber respond to her complaints?
Yeah, sure. So Rachel shared with me her correspondence with Uber, which was through their app and through sort of emails connected to their app. And basically, it's an automated system, or Uber has employees that sort of give canned responses or what seem to be sort of predetermined answers to drivers' questions. So when a driver like Rachel is facing harassment in her car and feels unsafe at times, the sorts of responses she's getting from Uber, just don't measure up to the severity, or in her mind, just didn't measure up to the severity of the situation. She would get, "Thank you for your concerns. Thanks for being a professional driver." Sometimes, every ride isn't an optimum ride. All drivers have to be flexible. These sorts of things, sort of like boilerplate, the kinds of responses you get if you submit a complaint, on a website or something, not the sort of thing that you would expect to get from the company you work for after you've been sexually harassed by a customer. This went on for several years. The reason why this was a particular concern to Rachel, she's no snowflake. She's been through a lot of tough stuff. She dealt with a lot of harassment. What she was particularly concerned with was that these riders would give her a low rating. Uber, every driver gets a rating out of 5 stars, and Uber is pretty tough. If your average falls below a couple percentage points below perfect, you can lose your job, or you can get froze out of the system.
Explain what losing. So on the rating systems in Uber, if you get any, and it's a 5-point system, right?
Yeah.
So explain what happens. What does getting quote unquote fired from Uber actually mean?
Yeah, so you can just get a note that says, "Hey, your average has fallen below." So it changes city to city and time to time. Uber, it's not 4.8 you get fired. It's sort of a dynamic system. It's the average on a weekly basis, aggregated over a month. Uber's not super transparent about exactly what a rating that disqualifies you is, but if you get enough ratings that are low, and it is something around 4.6, 4.7, so it's not we're not talking about a rating that's an average of a 1. We're talking about a B plus, right? If you get below a B plus, at a certain point, I've talked to lots of drivers who have had this happen to them. Uber will just send you a note and be like, "Listen, your quality is not high enough. You can no longer drive for us." And there's some options to rehabilitate yourself, but they're not free. You can go take a driving course with Uber. You can pay them to give you a sort of how to be more polite as a rider.
How to accept sexual harassment. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. Well, who knows?
Right.
So you can dispute these ratings as you're a driver. You can say "Hey, I didn't do anything wrong. This shouldn't be. I shouldn't have gotten a low star rating for this." But this is obviously an exhausting process. You're trying to work. You're driving around and you notice you get a low star rating, and you have to type an email to Uber to dispute it, and it's going through an automated system where there's no personal touch. There's no way you're going to ever get anyone on the phone to explain yourself. And I've seen a lot of these back and forth emails between drivers and the company, and they're very impersonal, and it's what you'd expect from a company that has hundreds of thousands of people driving for them. They're probably fielding thousands of complaints a day. It's not, there's no easy fix here, but the point is that in the case of female drivers, they're in a particularly tough spot because on the one hand, their Ubers, got them alone in a car with a strange man. But they, if they're in an uncomfortable situation, potentially a place where they could be hit on or someone could be intimidating them, and they don't have an easy recourse through the company to, dispute a rating or, figure out, for example, they can submit a complaint about the passenger. This guy made me feel unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no system for them to follow up and appeal or figure out if the company has banned that person from the platform, get any answers about what kind of investigation has taken place. I mean, this Uber sort of has does whatever they want. They have their own prerogative to sort of follow up on these complaints. And they're not particularly transparent about what they do on the back end.
Yeah, so it's really just, it fits the pattern of, and I think that this is like what we're discovering with all aspects of this, the gig economy, the tech economy, all of these platforms. There's always the kind of, it's the frowny emoji that's concealed behind the smiley emoji, if I could do a disgusting analogy like that, right? It's the kind of like, be your own boss, have complete freedom, work as a contractor. The corollary of that is there's no protection for you in this job. We don't have serious mechanisms around sexual harassment. We can change your price structure at any point. That's the corollary of there's no, collective nature to this. So it's sold as very empowering, but actually, you're just an isolated subject to a massive, corporate behemoth. But we're going to get to, because this is obviously a bigger problem at Uber specifically as a company, but there's a gender dimension and a class dimension. But before we get to that, did she ever, after years of talking about this, did she ever receive any type of actual response, like human response?
Yeah, so she says that I think she would go for Uber for about 4 years,
right,
where she kind of continuously submitted complaints about transphobia, particularly from passengers, and worrying that she was on the verge of losing her job because of low ratings from passengers who were biased against her. And she says that 3 years into a regular rounds of complaints, she did receive a phone call from a manager at Uber who checked in on her. Mm-hmm. So it took about 3 years. Uber, I spoke with Uber extensively for this investigation, and all they would say about Rachel's case, because Rachel bravely, I spoke to a lot of women for this piece, but Rachel is the only one who was willing to use her real name because she no longer drives for Uber. But all the other women, are not trying to provoke the wrath of the company, so I wasn't able to ask Uber specifically about their names and the instances of harassment that they had raised to me, because I didn't want to get them in trouble. But Rachel was okay with that. So, I brought this to Uber and I showed them the documentation. And they said to me that the instances that she had raised had been investigated. But they wouldn't tell me what that investigation entailed or what that really meant.
Right.
It's sort of, up to us to imagine what that means for Uber. So it's very possible that some of these passengers who were, harassing her were kicked off the Uber platform. Like, that's totally possible. Uber didn't say that happened, but they said that they do that in cases where they have determined that someone is, a serial harasser. But drivers are not able to, get that information. That's something that Uber does, behind closed doors. So, that's where she's no longer driving with Uber, and the impetus for this piece was, back in February, Susan Fowler, who was an engineer at Uber, went public with what was, a pretty harrowing tale of gender-based discrimination and sexual harassment at Uber's corporate headquarters. And And Uber responded to that, in a really swift and sort of decisive way. They hired Eric Holder to investigate. They brought board R.N. Huffington, who's a board member of Uber, sort of quarterback the PR response. And there was a massive
supposedly
kind of public
Travis
campaign.
Kalanick started crying at a company-wide meeting. There was
Exactly.
There was a lot of melodrama and a lot of gnashing of teeth. Though again, if you read Susan Fowler's original post, clearly we can say with certitude if her story is correct, and and obviously not only have they not denied it, in fact they've jumped up into action around it, just as you're outlining. There was a policy there not a formal policy, but essentially a woman who was an engineer who had a very good position in Uber. She reported, sexual harassment, sexual propositioning from her boss, her immediate leader, to human resources. And she was essentially told that, well, the only move now is for you to go to another team because you've burned that bridge. There wasn't even
right. If it happened the way she said it happened,
yeah.
That's completely illegal.
Totally
right?
illegal.
So,
right.
Right. So she, and Uber knows that. It's not only illegal; it's tremendously embarrassing for the company.
Right.
So they sprung into action, and there's been a multi-month-long investigation that's still underway, headed by Eric Holder and Covington Burling, his law firm.
Right. But this is Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So by all accounts, there's no the findings from this investigation and review of their sexual harassment and gender-based discrimination policies is thorough and underway. But sort of the scoop in my story and what no one else had reported yet was that Uber told me that review does not extend to those drivers like Rachel and their experiences.
Right, and that's the class and employment dimension of it. And Galindo told you herself that she sees parallels between her experience and Susan's, and she's glad that the things are moving forward, but she's also heartbroken that, well, maybe, illegal behavior, gender discrimination and abuse, maybe we can sort of understand after being embarrassed that that's wrong to treat an engineer that way, but drivers, what? That's how it comes off in the story.
Yeah, so there's a couple important distinctions, right? First of all, there's a legal distinction, which is that, Rachel was not an employee of the company. She's an independent contractor.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the company doesn't have any liability. There's in a lot of states, including California, some workplace-based discrimination statutes do extend to independent contractors and specific purposes, but by and large, she's in a much weaker position as an independent contractor versus an employee. And the second thing, which is an important distinction, I think, also, is that, what happened to Susan Fowler was that other employees of the company were treating her, as she says, unfairly because of her gender.
Right.
What's happened with Rachel and the women drivers I'm talking about is customers, right?
Right.
So it's important. That's an important distinction, and you have to be fair-minded and recognize that people who work in customer service deal with rude and inappropriate and harassing customers. That's just going to happen in customer service and driving. The question that I want to raise with Uber is that they have a kind of unique set of tools at their disposal. They have the personal information of all of their passengers. They have a tremendous amount of data that they're soaking up about everyone who uses that platform. And unlike a Starbucks, they can actually decide who gets to use their platform.
Right.
You can't bar someone from a Starbucks, but you can kick people off the Uber app who are harassers or inappropriate towards women.
Yeah, Uber's more analogous to being a member of a gym or a private club than Starbucks in the sense that
totally, right? So,
yeah.
So you would imagine, or one could hope, and that with all of the resources that Uber has and the sort of new frontier of this employment relationship, this customer and the relationship between the customer and the driver, that Uber would marshal these new resources to create a safe work environment to the best of their ability for their women drivers, right? That's one could hope or expect that, or at least that's what the women I spoke to would have hoped for Uber, given that they spend hundreds of millions of dollars investing in driverless cars or in mapping technology. But it seems like there's been really no commensurate investment in creating a safe work environment for the people that generate money for the company.
Well, maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
So that's sort of an important distinction here. I talked to a lot of employment lawyers for this piece, and they told me, like, legally women like Rachel are in a really tough spot. It's hard to build a case that Uber has done anything illegal here and not responding to their complaints adequately, or at least in their mind adequately. It's tough because they're these independent contractors and they're talking about customers, but I think everyone I spoke to said that Uber's policies surrounding this didn't demonstrate serious concern or effort made to make the female drivers comfortable at the company. And I think that that's an important distinction from the Fowler case. But it's endemic of the precarious work situation these women find themselves in. They have very few legal protections.
I think that, to me, and maybe this is Uber's answer, would be that we are dealing with the problem by investing in driverless cars because we're going to eliminate all of our contractors over the next couple of years, so nobody will be harassed. But I do think,
I think that's an important part of my piece, right? A lot of women just quit. Right. Uber's labor model, to a large extent, kind of relies on the churn. A huge portion of their drivers sign up, try it out, make some money for Uber, decide that it's really not a great job, or they're making below minimum wage, or the passengers are harassing them for whatever reason, and they quit. And that's no skin off Uber's back because they have zero startup costs. Every driver buys their own car, runs their own gas, right? So, like, for every additional driver driving for Uber, it doesn't cost Uber a cent. So from their perspective, it really doesn't matter if their drivers stay or leave as long as they keep driving, or that they keep attracting new drivers.
Right. So we need to really, I think ultimately this becomes a new question of, what are the labor rights and organizing and policy models for dealing with this in today's tech environment. But the piece is, as Uber probes sexual harassment at its offices, it overlooks hundreds of thousands of female drivers. It's in The Intercept. We have a link to it. Avi Asher-Schapiro. Thanks for joining me, man. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks. Anytime.
Hi, folks. It's Sam Seder. You know me from just a minute ago. Listen, we've had a problem on YouTube. Let me make a graphic visualization. Back in March, our revenue and the ads that were monetized was a lot, like here. And now, over the course of actually within a day into April, it's down to about here. Now, this is just a artist rendering, but that's basically it. We were here, and now we're here. That's because of some YouTube thing where advertisers were concerned on being on hate sites. And, of course, we're a news organization that sometimes talks about hateful people, and we got caught up in their algorithm. I thought it would be fixed by now. It's not. We need your help to keep giving you free content on YouTube. We don't have the advertiser support that we had even back, here. So we're looking for your help. Go to our Patreon site, give a couple of bucks. Literally, you could give a couple, and it would be very helpful. Head over there. Here's the link right here or down there. It's somewhere around here. Find it and go help us out. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the show.